All right, well, welcome everybody to our latest Ask a Chief of Staff workshop. Super excited for all of us to be here to learn from somebody who I have personally been following on LinkedIn and connected with for quite some time. And so I'm very excited to hear from. Today, we have here with us Katherine, who is now the founder of Flywheel Executive Coaching, which offers strategic and career coaching services to tech leaders, entrepreneurs, those looking to make a change in their career. But more importantly, Katherine has served 2 times as a chief of staff, once at Hyperscience and once at Bubble. So 2 different stages of startups. And today we are going to be talking about establishing trust with your principals, something that Katherine has done more than 2 times over. So she has a lot of experience in this field. And we're going to keep this very fireside chatty. So everybody, I want you to bring your questions, ask them in the chat. I have prepared some questions to ask Katherine to kick us off, but I would love to hear from all of you to see what kinds of questions you have for Katherine, and we will definitely have time to call you off mute, have you ask those questions to Katherine directly, and all learn from her knowledge. So everybody give a warm virtual round of applause to Katherine and welcome her to the stage today.
Thanks for that, Clara.
Amazing.
Big emoji fan.
I love it. I'm seeing all the little claps coming in, and it's so lovely to have all of us here today. So, Katherine, why don't we start with you? I would love for you to give an introduction. I know I talked a little bit about you, but you obviously have more context. So, start us off. Let us know a little bit about you and your chief of staff and career journey.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks again for the warm welcome. I would say that, so I've been working in tech for about, I don't know, going on 7 or 8 years at this point. But I first heard about the chief of staff role a few years ago. And as soon as I even heard of this concept, I was really excited by it. And I was like, that's, I think, what I want to be doing. Prior to that, I had been working in finance at Deutsche Bank. I had been an operations manager at Oscar Health. Several different roles within finance and tech. But regardless of what my formal title was or which industry or size of company, I always felt like I was able to develop a really good relationship with the department head or managing director, whichever executive it was, that went a little bit beyond the day-to-day role. And I found that I like to be the person on the ground who was able to then communicate up to an executive what's going on day to day and play that role. So I got my first chief of staff role at Hyperscience, which is about a 400-person company, Series E, I believe. And this was just such a crash course, as all of you who are chiefs of staff know, especially when it's your first time being chief of staff and or the executive's first time having a chief of staff, just building that trust and relationship and communication with someone who's literally the founder and running the company is not an easy task and can pay off and just have such great rewards and value once you're able to establish that. And for my second chief of staff role, my transition, I was looking to actually be at an earlier stage company again. It's very different when you are on the leadership team where the head of sales might have been selling for literally 25 years. Sometimes there's a little bit less that as chief of staff, you're able to add value and advise in that situation. At my second company, Bubble, which was, I think it's probably 150 people now, Series B, we were still building out the executive team. So I was able to help form that team and the operating cadence and how we would work together as an exec team in a company. So that was a really unique and different aspect to that second chief of staff experience. And late last year, I decided to switch full-time into executive coaching, as Clara mentioned. I had been doing coaching on the side for some friends who were interested because I found that that was just a natural part of my chief of staff roles and possibly an aspect that I enjoyed even more compared to all the 100 things that we all do as chiefs of staff every day. So yeah, really looking forward to this workshop, to hearing your questions and whatever that, I can help sort of answer and advise on in terms of the situations that you all are facing as chiefs of staff, or perhaps looking to explore what can be next after a chief of staff role is always a question that's looming on our minds. So yeah, looking forward to today.
What an incredible intro. There's so much that I want to unpack in this next hour of conversation that we have. I think it's so interesting and something that I've heard echoed with a lot of chiefs of staff is that you have this ability already to kind of gain the trust of upper management or a director or a head department. And even before you stepped into the chief of staff role, you were already establishing these relationships. And then once you moved more formally into a chief of staff role, really capitalize on a lot of those learnings that you learned in prior instances, where now you can use that to establish the trust with a principal. So maybe let's start with just an overall importance. What would you say is the overall importance of establishing trust with your principal? Why is this such an important aspect and skill set to build when you are a chief of staff?
Yeah, I would. So I'll definitely dive into it. And I would even add that it's relevant even for people on the call who are perhaps not currently a chief of staff, and just in any job with your manager, with your principal, whoever it is that you're reporting to, it's crucial to both establish trust and open lines of communication, and to do so really quickly and as immediately as possible. The importance of it, I think, you can have the greatest background and resume and talents and interview experience in the world, but on starting from day one or week one, if you're not able to establish that level of trust and reliability, then it's going to be really hard for you to do your job effectively, and it becomes an uphill battle from there. So I think in order to be as effective as possible in your job, you want to build that relationship and openness with your manager or your CEO, and then also with, the broader team around you, whether that's an executive team or your colleagues or cross-functional, other leaders. It's just, I think in the first 30 to 90 days, that should be like your absolute top priority.
Completely agree here on everything that you're saying. And I love what you're saying about, even if you're not a chief of staff, right? This ability to establish trust is so crucial in any aspect of your role. And a question that I get a lot from aspiring chiefs of staff are, what are the skill sets that I need in order to make that transition? Or what are things that I can work on now so that I can set myself up better to become a successful chief of staff? And I think this is exactly one of those skill sets, is that establishing trust. You can do that in any capacity. It doesn't matter what your title is. Being able to build that relationship with somebody, have them feel like they can trust you and rely on you, is such an important skill set. So maybe we can talk a little bit about, what does a highly trusting relationship even look like? Maybe you can tackle it from like an individual contributor standpoint, and also from the chief of staff to the principal standpoint as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, again, different overlaps as well between the IC versus chief of staff areas of responsibility where you're establishing trust. But I think it looks like being the one on your end who's prepared for every single meeting, every single conversation, and one-on-one with an agenda and objective. And being the one who's organized enough to both prepare and then help to guide the conversation and follow up. So that thoroughness from start to finish is really important, especially the higher of a level an executive that you're dealing with and reporting into. They're not going to have that extra time and mental space to be able to do that. They are probably just trying to get through their day with tons of fire drills and lots of meetings that they may or may not be prepared for. So for them to come to that one-on-one time with you and know that you'll be there prepared to ask some good questions or bring up some new topics that you could be working on together, each and every time, I think, is where it starts. And then I've often heard of the phrase safe hands. So a safe pair of hands for that executive to hand you, whether it's, a project, an assignment, perhaps some challenge that they're going through or that the company or team is going through that they might need you to just have that knowledge and be able to divulge that to you, and that you'll always maintain discretion, always figure out what the next step and follow-up could be, and they can sort of trust you with that information or that responsibility. I do think, of course, that's earned over time and takes repetition, and each rep is an opportunity for you to show that you're reliable, that you're careful, you're double checking the data, and that you can be trusted with whatever they throw at you. So I think that's my interpretation of what a trusting relationship looks like.
I'm agreeing and just nodding agreement with everything that you're saying here. I think the most important thing here to note is it takes time. I think I've heard new chiefs of staff stepping into the role and saying, well, why can't I, get in the data room, or why do I not get to sit at all the board meetings day one? And these are things that you need to build up the trust to do so, right? With any working relationship or, a personal relationship, like you don't give everybody the kind of access keys to the kingdom day one. And I think remembering that there's this element of time that is just as important as the trust is being built, and this growing and burgeoning relationship is important to keep in mind. So maybe you mentioned, building trust is probably the most important thing that you can do as a chief of staff in your first 30, 60, 90 days. Can you maybe give some tactics or things that chiefs of staff should be doing in these first 3 months to really start to establish that foundation of trust? If you have any anecdotes or stories of things in particular. I know I'll have my own go-to one, so I'd love to share that, but I would love to pass it to you first and see if there are any particular experiences that you've had in building trust with your principals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the first couple of weeks, it's normal to have one-on-ones with the team around you and the other executives. But I found that this is more effective when you really structure it as a quote unquote listening tour. And with each, probably leadership team member that you're meeting with and introducing yourself to come even to those intro chats with specific questions in mind, with specific topics in mind, and to take each one as seriously as any business meeting, not just hey, nice to meet you, this is just a virtual coffee. I think being able to ask one thought-provoking question to each exec is going to start you off with the right impression. And frankly, if you're assuming you're reporting to a CEO, they're going to get their data points and their impressions of you also through those other leaders around them. So that's one, I think, important tactic. And another one is looking for quick wins. So once you've done that listening tour and hopefully, asked some really thoughtful questions, gathered some information, being able to be that proactive person and perhaps bring suggestions or ideas to your CEO is a really great way to, start off that working relationship. And also, I think aligning on things like the cadence of what your one-on-ones will be, what your job description that you were hired for entails, and really unpacking in an organized and structured way how you can most add value in the early days. Because again, it might say one thing on paper and your CEO might have talked to you about something in an interview, but not expecting anyone to hold your hand and showing that you're totally an independent person and leader who is going to proactively shape their role to whatever you can best do to add value, I think is going to start you off on the right foot.
+1 to everything that you're saying here. I love this suggestion of asking, just one thought-provoking question. I think if you're able to do that, it's going to show a level of curiosity, right, to these other members of the team. And it's also going to be able to establish your own credibility, right, within the rest of the leadership team. And one candidate that I worked with last year even went so far as, even before she was hired into the role, already to start building those bonds with the rest of the executive team. It was, part of her interview process to get to meet others on the leadership team. And in that moment, she was already asking questions like, what are your biggest blockers right now? If you could be unblocked on one thing, or what are the bottlenecks? And by asking those those types of questions, I think you establish that, one, you have this curiosity about what's going on, not just in the office of the CEO, but around that as well. And then also, you can start to think of what exactly these quick wins would look like. And so the story that I personally like to use as one to showcase this is that when I was a chief of staff at a Series A company, we were a small team of about, I always say, I was employee number 6 or 6 through 10, depending on when we walked in the door that day. 4 of us were hired all at once. And we had a 3-person executive team, a CEO, who was my principal, a CTO in charge of our engineering team, and then a CSO, which is a chief science officer, which I think is a little different from most other startups. And so we had this large open source community, and we had a lot of contributors who were, contributing code, giving suggestions, all of this kind of stuff. And we had a big launch. I think probably this was maybe 2 or 3 months in. And the CSO really wanted to reward all of these people who had been contributing and send them a little piece of swag, something in the mail to kind of commemorate their time working on this project. And I saw that as an opportunity to step in, because I knew that it wasn't the best use of our chief science officer's time to go and research what kind of swag should we send out, shipping details, even how to ship things internationally, because we were an international community. And kind of the added caveat on top of that was that it was COVID. So shipping was a nightmare anywhere that we were going. And so because I had experience ordering swag for other companies, printing all of this, I saw it as an opportunity for me to step in and say, let me take this project off your plate. Let me get it to the finish line, where all you have to do is say yes or no. Is this the piece of thing that you want to send out? And this is my estimated budget for doing so. And so, gave back, I don't know how many exact hours of time, but a substantial number of hours of time back to our chief science officer. And because that project was executed well, later on, when our CTO decided that I think it'd be really great for us to have a monthly newsletter. Claire, do you think you could take that on? And feel free to use the engineers as your resource to get this project off the ground. It became this really great way for us to start to collaborate on things. And it felt less transactional than us asking for each other's time and resources. It became much more of this collaborative approach. And I really like to use that as a strong milestone in my first 3 months, where I was able to get, the rest of the executive team, if not on my side, at least there to help and support, and not ask questions of like, why do you need this information, but trusting me to do some of these things.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. It speaks to a lot of the themes we've been talking about, getting that buy-in from the key allies and other collaborators with the CEO, and then also being proactive. It's something that could have come onto your plate, but by raising your hand to do it, you're already positioning yourself as someone who solves problems and jumps in and, gets things done. So that's, I think, the key outcome that you want from your work on establishing trust in the beginning.
Absolutely. So maybe one thing that could be interesting, considering you've worked with now leaders and CEOs, and you've seen the relationships with chiefs of staff as well, what would you say are some of the challenges or issues that can make it hard to establish trust with a principal?
Yeah, for sure. I would say the first thing is probably the literal lack of time that a typical CEO has. It's amazing how often someone may want a chief of staff or hire a chief of staff and then not be able to, or not prioritize the time to actually fit in building the relationship with the chief of staff and getting the most out of it. So I think that's why I keep coming back to that principle of being proactive, showing what you can do right away, because the more they see those small examples and quick wins, the more they'll be willing to carve out that time. And that, again, it's on yourself as a chief of staff to forge that path and say, this is what I think I should be doing and what the role should be like, and not be afraid to be that first person to raise your hand instead of waiting always for marching orders. That may or may not come depending on your CEO or principal's personality. And then one other challenge is there are times, and I've been asked this before in an interview, were there executives who, did not buy into the role of chief of staff and the value of having one on the leadership team? And the answer is absolutely yes. Have seen that before. And there are certain other executives who may be very guarded about their own relationship with the CEO or feel threatened by someone coming on who isn't running a specific team or department. So it definitely takes a lot of time and empathy and patience to break down some of those barriers. Again, the tactics and techniques would be the same of trying to establish that relationship from a social perspective, from a work perspective, how you all can work together. And I think that comes down to an aspect of relying a little bit on your CEO to also explain the role and sort of promote you as an ally and a cross-functional collaborator to all the other executives. But again, they may not be aware of that dynamic unless you inform them. So there's definitely tricky things to navigate. There always are when you either are a leader or are working among a lot of executives with big personalities. And I think hopefully a trait that we share as, being in the chief of staff role or wanting to be in the chief of staff role is someone who is empathetic enough to understand where all these different people are coming from and how to navigate all of these different personalities. But I'm not going to say it's easy. It's definitely a challenge at times.
There's a couple things in that last answer you gave that I definitely want to unpack. I also want to remind everybody to drop your questions into the chat as you think of them. We will have a dedicated Q&A portion towards the end, but feel free to start dropping questions in there. And if you see a question that you really like, add a little emoji to it so we can definitely make sure it gets asked toward the end. So you mentioned at the top of your answer, time can be a huge challenge in trying to even get the time to build trust, to have conversations, to start to establish that relationship. So what would you suggest when it comes to setting up a cadence of checking in with your principal? What are things that you've tried in the past? What are things that have worked? And then I'll add in the kind of additional wrinkle of what about for remote chiefs of staff? So maybe we can start with an operating cadence between you and your principal and then kind of working through there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say one counterintuitive thing that I learned here, at least from my experience, is do not take your CEO's lead on this. My first experience as a chief of staff, I had a CEO who was very much not structured in how they worked, didn't, according to themselves, did not have a very particular management style. And so their suggestion was, let's just meet ad hoc whenever there is something in particular to discuss. And that was not a good idea. So once I found that this wasn't very effective and there wasn't as much communication and establishment of trust as I would have liked in the very first couple of weeks, literally putting that time, even if it was 1 hour per week or whatever it was that we could carve out, made it immediately such a more effective relationship. So I really learned from that. As chiefs of staff and people who are aiming to step into that role, we do crave to take that direction and guidance from our CEO. But on this aspect of setting the relationship, establishing the communication, I really encourage, us as the chief of staff to take the lead and establish that cadence. And that can be, a few times a week in the early days and then tapering off, and always making sure to make good use of that time and to find areas where, okay, we no longer need to meet twice a week. I'm now starting to work more independently. I'm going to then proactively take off one instance of that meeting and we'll just meet weekly. Whatever that is, being open to adjusting and being flexible. But in the beginning, more check-ins is definitely preferable. And then in terms of remote chiefs of staff, that's definitely been the role that I've played in both of my chief of staff experiences. I started on April Fool's Day in 2020 in my first chief of staff role. So it was everyone navigating the remote work world together. There's the obvious answer of it's really great to establish that in-person time too, and you want to make sure to prioritize that when you can get it. But I think figuring out what your working style is and working hours, and then how that kind of meshes with the CEO and the executive team's working styles and hours is the most important. Figuring out what they value in terms of the level of communication. Are they Slack people? Do they prefer to email, phone call, whatever it is obviously going to be crucial in the remote world. And now that we do have the option to get together, being that person who can bring together perhaps the whole executive team for summits or help to plan company-wide offsites, and thinking about how to maximize the in-person time that you do have is a really great way to navigate that remote chief of staff role. If you're able to get that in-person FaceTime for yourself, that's great. But when you can take it to the next level and think strategically about how you can spread that more broadly, even beyond your one-on-one relationship with the exec, I think that's a really good way to add value.
I hear you on all that. And I have a similar experience. When I started as a chief of staff, I started in February of 2020. So I had about a month worth of kind of in-person time with my executive. And then we had to very quickly move to asynchronous and fully remote communications as well. And I would say like very similar. I think it's counterintuitive, but it actually is the right move here, is that, don't take your principal's lead when it comes to setting up that cadence. And oftentimes for me, especially, it was my first time being in a chief of staff role. It was my CEO's first time having a chief of staff. So, both of us were trying to figure it out. And so sometimes I think it's important to kind of realize that the CEO doesn't have all the answers either. And sometimes it's up to both of you to try to solution this out together and figure out what the best way to meet. One other thing that you said about kind of getting the rest of the exec team's buy-in, right, about the role. I would say thinking about how to best have your CEO be an advocate for you, day one. Katherine is coming in as my chief of staff. This is what to expect. This is the kind of level of access that I expect you to give her, or the kind of time and attention for these things, I think is very important. But I also think that there's a cadence of you rewriting your own job description every couple of months and reiterating that to the executive. So was wondering if you could speak a little bit on that. One, it's kind of that, how do you build that relationship with the rest of the executive team to make them feel at ease, right? I think sometimes there's this thought that if you bring in a chief of staff, they're going to come and spy on, the rest of the executive team. So if you have any thoughts on mitigating that, and then as your role continues to grow and change over time, how do you reiterate your new responsibilities over time as the company continues to move forward?
Yeah, great question. Something that worked really well for my first chief of staff role was I found that a couple of the executives who are more initially open-minded to working with me and collaborating closely with me, they weren't in my sort of area of focus initially. I came from previously like a customer success and project management background. I would say on the customer success and sales side, where I'd worked before a little bit, those leaders were more seasoned and tenured. And so it took more time to establish that trust and communication. On the other hand, there was a newer executive who was running product. There were some executives who were based in a foreign country in engineering. And just through talking to them more, I found that I was able to add value. They wanted me to look over their documents and things that they were trying to put out to their team, help with reorganizing or growing their teams, and just being able to be, someone for them to rely on. I didn't sort of limit myself saying, hey, I don't have a product and engineering background. I'm just someone who has experience in startups and experience with, growing or reorganizing teams in the past, and you're open to working with me. So let's do this. Through building those relationships with them, I think, and being able to add value on that side and increase the collaboration, even among those executives, I was able to, again, show how I could add value to the CEO, because he didn't then have to be the person in the weeds sorting through some of those details. Together, we were able to bring a more organized and coherent plan to the CEO. So I could be that like checkpoint before it got to his level. And then, being part of the broader executive team, it could show the other leaders like, hey, Katherine is helping and contributing and adding value, not hindering or trying to spy or anything that some other leaders might be suspicious of in the early days if they have not worked with a chief of staff before. So I think that took, me believing in myself that I can actually add value without having a product and engineering background. Was there a second part of your question?
Yes, I believe so. The second part of my question was around reiterating your job description to the team as a whole, I guess, as your responsibilities are growing, or maybe some things are closed out, or even one thing that I see often is maybe you spun up one function and now you've hired somebody else to take that on, but people are still coming to you. So how can you kind of reestablish what your role is in a way that makes sense? And maybe there's a cadence for it, or maybe you have experience in particular where you've had to kind of do something like that to reiterate what exactly it is that you're responsible for as the chief of staff.
Yep, absolutely. I would say as a chief of staff, one of your important roles is to help establish the operating cadence and like reporting structure, if there might be one, for your whole executive team. And you should very much include yourself in that. So when you are running a leadership team meeting or gathering the leadership team updates, which are very common, parts of the chief of staff role, include those things and those projects, wins and challenges for yourself as well. Don't let yourself, in my opinion, become just the facilitator and moderator of that for everyone else. That's the key role. But also, you are a part of this exec team and leadership team as well. And so you should be sharing all the same level of detail and updates as much as possible on your own role, in addition to just amplifying that and sharing that for the other executives. Once I started doing that, I think that really helped. And it helps because, like you mentioned, your own role is evolving, what you're working on week to week. It's not as clear cut as simply running sales or, working on the latest product. And giving that visibility automatically establishes even more transparency and confidence in your own role.
You're giving me two really perfect segues here. One is about establishing this operating rhythm and cadence. For those of you who don't know, Katherine is actually one of our instructors for our Chief of Staff School as well, which is kicking off in the next week. And her week of curriculum is focused on operating rhythms and cadences. So we'll leave her last answer there as a little sneak preview of additional learnings and curriculum to come. Then the other part of your answer that I think is a perfect segue to one of the questions that we have here in the chat is about publicizing your own wins and successes in the chief of staff role without coming across as too self-promoting. So I think you already started to touch on this, but I would love to kind of dig deeper a little bit into, how do you track your own progress as a chief of staff? How do you know that you are progressing? And how do you relay that to your principal, first of all, right? As a year comes up, as performance reviews come up and things like that, but also to show, your own career trajectory growing in the chief of staff role.
Yeah. I think this should best be done on, both a shorter term and longer term recurring basis. So if you're gathering weekly updates from each executive, as I mentioned, for the leadership team meeting, include your own updates in there. Bring up your own cross-functional topics to add to that meeting, and don't just play the host and facilitator. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I think can be really impactful is having your own set of chief of staff or office of the CEO OKRs. If other execs are writing OKRs and sharing them and workshopping them, within the leadership team, you should feel free to do so as well. And that can be an area where it's a natural segue for your one-on-ones with the rest of the leadership team. Here are some of the things that I'm thinking of drafting as my OKRs this quarter. is there anything you think is missing? Is there anything where you and I could work together, or I could help unblock you? It's similar to the other agenda questions and topics that we've been, discussing, but it's in an even more structured way where you're willing to even put that goal publicly out there and document it to show how much you're committed to helping these other leaders. And sometimes unblocking those other leaders and working together with them is one of the most impactful things you can do for your CEO. So yeah, making sure that it happens on both the shorter term and longer term basis, and slotting it into those existing mechanisms. You're not tooting your horn too much. You are adding to and contributing to the already critical processes of OKRs and leadership meetings. And so it feels more natural that way.
Absolutely. I talked to a former chief of staff today, and her belief and perspective and opinion that I agree with is that chief of staff is just as much a part of that C-suite, that chief blank officer, as any of the other leaders in the room. And so it's important that you are using your voice, and it's not a kind of matter of pride, right? Of saying, oh, look at me, I did this, but it's to keep everybody else informed as well, because you run the function of your principal's office, which is very important. And so one couple of things that I can help recommend as well, because I do get this question a lot about, well, how do I know if I've grown, or how do I keep track of the things that I've done, is to take a little bit of time to reflect, but if it's every week, every other week, and keep what I like to call a brag sheet or a work diary of everything that you have touched, because I think it's going to be more than you expect. I think as a chief of staff, you are very much in this servant leader role, right? You are looking to serve the executive team, especially your principal. And it can feel like, oh, well, I just did that thing because that's what's expected of me. But those are just as important to document and keep track of. And so if you can take a little bit of time every week to write down, here are the things that I touched, here are things that I either was a part of the discussion, part of the decision-making process, part of the solutioning, or even just was a pair of eyes on an extra project or anything like that. Those things will add up over time. And I think once you are able to start to cumulatively record these things, you're going to see that you have been responsible and consulted on a lot more than what you can think of when it comes to the end of the year and you're trying to like pull things from your brain here. All right, so I'm going to work through a couple of questions here in the chat, and I'm seeing that back to this kind of check-in with your principal. Maybe two things here. What ended up being kind of the cadence of check-in that you did with your principal? Maybe we can start there as an example. And if you had different ones at Bubble and Hyperscience, would love to kind of hear the different ways that you set up check-ins there. And then what, when you say bringing an objective to the meeting or an agenda to the meeting, could you maybe share some sample items that you have brought to meetings before?
Yeah. Before I dive in, and I made a note of your two questions, I just wanted to add on to your last answer and say, by having that brag sheet and reflecting on it monthly or weekly, whatever it may be, it really ties back to something else you mentioned about evolving your job description over time. You'll be able to spot patterns of where you were able to have the greatest impact, which leaders you worked with the best, which additional deeper or higher level projects you may be able to take on. And that can inform how you as a chief of staff grow over the next few quarters or years. And I think without doing that level of reflection, you might be a little bit more, thrown into many different directions and many different projects and areas. If you take that time and prioritize, that reflection, then you'll be able to start to connect the dots of where your role can head. So I think that's a really important point that I just wanted to add on there. Cadence of check-ins, I don't think there was anything magical that I did, except in, again, making the first CEO have a cadence. And I think it was weekly, with both of them in the end. It was initially bi-weekly with the first CEO because we wanted even more dedicated time as we were sort of catching up from having that ad hoc, non-cadence in the beginning. I think if anything, I probably spent more time at my second company figuring out what the cadence should be with all the other leaders. There were actually 2 co-founders and CEOs. And there'd be times where there were things to discuss with both of them together or with one co-founder versus another. So that was a tricky thing to navigate. So yeah, again, I don't think anything particularly special about my approach, except to be thoughtful about it and to always be open to updating it. It might need to become more frequent or less frequent with any given leader. So just being open to that and making sure that you find it an effective use of time. It's, I think, always a good thing to be humble and practical and straightforward enough to delete or reduce a meeting once it's not that useful, and to be really open about that. I think people do appreciate that. And then in terms of agenda topics, I think you mentioned, Clara, asking like, what is one thing that could really unblock you? I think asking about cross-functional topics, those are the ones that really can slip through the cracks and could have a major impact on the company, but no one owner. That's the perfect place for you to come in. So whether that's you yourself, once you've been in the role for a few months and you spot a potential gap, one of my companies was, I would say, the customer enablement process. So, you have the marketing team, of course, that's creating collateral. You have the sales team that's selling, and the product team was building something. But who is the person who's going to bring all of that together for a new product launch? And what is that timeline? And are all those moving pieces working together? Being able to ask some of the leaders and the CEO about that, I think, was just a very specific example of a cross-functional area that I touched on that I think had a good impact. And I think, trying to dig a little deeper, asking like, what keeps you up at night? What do you think is the biggest challenge on your team? Is there any way that I can help with that? Or is there any sort of support that you might need from another leader or another team specifically? I think being even just one layer more detailed and asking like, what is a blocker? What is a challenge? Can help you get to a perhaps more revealing and deeper answer in the one-on-one.
Absolutely. I think these one-on-ones, I think it's important to remember that this is not just about, I'm seeing it here in the chat, it's not necessarily just an update check-in, right? It's not just a time for you to say red, yellow, green on XYZ things that we're working on. But I want to kind of echo Katherine's point here about going one level deeper and asking these kinds of questions that are going to help reveal a little bit more about what exactly is going on, because there's always kind of like the top of mind fire, right? Like if something has happened that day or that week, that's always going to be the thing that feels like it's the most urgent, but in perspective may not be. And it's how can you ask the right kinds of probing questions in order to really kind of get to the crux of what's really the blocker here. And so I would say sometimes it's about asking the same question in a different way. One exercise that I used to do with my CEO, we would try to do it, once a quarter, I would say, is that I would kind of give him a pie chart and say, can you give me a percentage breakdown of how you are currently spending your time? And then give me a percentage breakdown of how you would like to be spending your time. And I think that often revealed actually what the true kind of mismatch of priorities or what he wanted to spend time on, but couldn't because of, I'm actually spending way too much time on client calls, and it would be more helpful if I could actually focus more on hiring, right? Hiring a person who could take on client calls is going to be a better use of my time than me fielding all these calls. So that revealed that, the hiring priority actually needed to be higher than, XYZ. So I think like being able to kind of ask the same question in different ways is always a really great tactic here. And then maybe when it comes, I see Beta, you have a question here about trying to get more out of this one-on-one time regarding mentoring, feedback, your principals' needs, things there. So maybe Katherine, you can speak to this a little bit. But one thing that I probably hear a lot of is, well, how do I make sure that I get like the management or mentorship that I need within the chief of staff role. So I'm curious to hear what your opinions on this are when it comes to your own chief of staff, like growth and career trajectory and figuring out what comes next, and how you can use your principal to maybe have some of those conversations.
Yeah, that's a great question from Bita. I would start off by saying I found it to be one of the challenges of the role. I don't think that most CEOs and founders have it as ingrained in them necessarily, to be proactively thinking about the career path, because the other people they're hiring and working with day to day already run sales, marketing, et cetera, and their trajectory is pretty clear. And then the one that's going to be more vague and evolving and require a lot more hands-on, collaboration and effort to define the path is probably yourself as the chief of staff. So the first thing I would say is make sure to find other mentors and people that you can learn from and grow from and get feedback from, because it may not naturally be that top priority for your for your CEO. Just putting that out there as my personal experience. And then I think, again, being that person to bring ideas proactively to the table based on your accomplishments and wins. So it wouldn't make sense, for example, a couple of quarters in to say, hey, like on my resume, you can see I've run a marketing team before or something like that in the past. So I think that I should just be in that area and perhaps like take on a lot more projects there. It could make sense to suggest something like that if you can say, look, I've worked with the head of marketing a lot. We have a great established working relationship. Here are some of the accomplishments and projects that I've done so far. And I noticed that we have a gap where we don't have anyone in product marketing. And I do have a bit of a background on that. So something where it's like borne out by your actual experience and work that you've done at the company is a great way to start to shape that conversation with your CEO.
Again, +1 to everything you're saying here. I think the most important thing to remember is that you don't have to do it alone, right? You may be the only chief of staff at your organization, but you're not the only chief of staff that exists in the world. And that's why, for me personally, I'm a strong believer of finding your own network, finding your own community of other chiefs of staff or just other people that you feel like you can trust and can mentor you and guide you in the right directions when it comes to thinking about stuff like this. One thing that Katherine, I would want to kind of touch on before we start to wrap things up is that as you progress through your chief of staff role, you were a chief of staff twice. Now you head your own company in executive coaching. What were your kind of thought processes as you move through these roles? What made you decide, I want to take on another chief of staff role? And then what made you ultimately decide, okay, the chief of staff part of my career is over. It's time to start my own thing. I'd love to kind of get your thought process on how you navigated through those transitions of your own career.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that in my first chief of staff role, that was also where I encountered the first executive coach. And each CEO that I worked with did have an executive coach. I also had an experience of hiring an exec coach for an entire leadership team to help that cross-functional collaboration. And I started to really see the value of that new role, just like when I had been in previous tech roles, learning staff role. I think for my second time around as chief of staff, I started to feel like I've done a lot of the types of projects and already have run all hands or established town hall communications, investor relations, updates, all these things that felt more new and more a learning opportunity the first time. The second time where I would have loved to lean in more was on that coaching and advising, especially in fire drill situations or, really stressful situations that we all encounter in startups. And I found that each CEO, again, already had their own executive coach who it's nice to have someone who's outside of the company, not reporting to you, not biased because they, do rely on you as their direct manager and for reviews and all of that to be able to come in and provide that perspective as a coach. So that's when I started talking to a couple of friends who also worked in tech and saying like, hey, the chief of staff role is really fun and engaging, but I think I want to lean in more to that coaching aspect. It's something I really enjoy. It's some role that's already been, filled by an outside executive coach. And one of my friends who works startup said, don't have a whole business plan, just start coaching me. He himself already had a coach, and that just happened very organically, to start talking to more of my friends and getting referrals and finding that people felt better after that conversation with me, and they felt like they had more guidance and they were more energized or whatever it was that they were looking for. So for me, I had never envisioned myself doing anything entrepreneurial on my own. People come to the chief of staff role with all different types of objectives. Some want to be a founder CEO. Some want to continue being attached to executives. So I think this is my personal way of putting my own stamp on it, being able to help so many leaders and people in different situations so that you're always learning and able to help even more than one executive or leader at a time has been a really special part of being able to do coaching full time.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. I want everybody to please give a huge round of applause to Katherine for spending this hour with us. It was so great to hear from you and learn from you. And want to give a couple of minutes for us to just chat about a couple of logistical housekeeping items. So your last answer is a perfect segue into this, but Katherine, where can people learn more about the coaching that you do? And if people wanted to reach out and contact you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, thank you so much. I am putting into the chat my website. And so if anyone has any follow-up questions from this chat or wants to do the consultation or learn what it's like to be a coach, I'm open to any and all of the above. So you can find me there as well as on LinkedIn, which you just shared. And for those perhaps in the aspiring chief of staff bucket, I hope that you'll check out the Chief of Staff Academy that Clara mentioned. And again, we're going to have even more structured content there, week to week, what it takes to be a chief of staff, assignments, and being really hands-on about how to set yourself up for success in the role. So yeah. And then if people have questions now, also happy to talk through anything that's on your minds, any challenges that you're currently going through, or things that Clara and I could help advise you on.
Amazing. So I'm throwing in a bunch of links into the chat here. We have our Chief of Staff School, which is finishing up our application. So if you're still interested, we're taking applications till the end of the week. Also, if you're looking for a community of chiefs of staff, both aspiring, former, and current chiefs of staff, and you would like to join, we just announced our Ask a Chief of Staff community. It's a Slack group with more speakers like Katherine and experts and residents who have all been a part of the chief of staff ecosystem for quite some time. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. So if anybody else wants to drop a question here, we can definitely have you ask that. I think there's one here in the chat that I don't think we got to yet. All right, question from Carrie. Since there's so much we can take on as a new chief of staff for a principal, what are some approaches to help set boundaries while you are still trying to prove yourself?
I love that question because I think it's something I struggled with a lot in my first role as chief of staff. This was when everyone was very much still under COVID lockdown mode, and it felt like there was nothing to do but be on Zoom and Slack and with the CEO or other leaders almost 24/7, which was not healthy. So I would say, whether you're in a remote or an in-person setting, make sure that you establish your own working hours and block off the times on your calendar that are not available. Simple tactical things like that will go a long way. And what I found was once I started doing that a bit more, the CEO and COO, who I'd been talking with constantly all hours of the day and night, everyone appreciated it. Everyone actually has their home lives and personal lives, and being able to set that example for yourself and set those boundaries, or remind your principals that you're working with about their own time that they need to carve out away from work, I think is a really good thing that you can do. So yeah, I think finding that right balance between when you should be available and accessible versus, when you need to take that time for yourself, it's tricky. And again, it needs to evolve, and make that part of your reflection, along with the brag sheet concept that Clara talked about earlier. Also think through, are you finding that right balance? Do you think your CEO has that right balance? And it can be something to check in on and reflect on for both of you.
Amazing. Well, a beautiful question to end on, setting your own boundaries and also leading by example. I think this is such an important aspect of the chief of staff role that I'm sure we could spend another hour discussing. But how do you influence without authority? How do you lead and manage upwards and lead from behind? And I think that is the kind of perfect question to kind of leave us all to ponder as we go on about our days. So thank you again, Katherine, for spending this hour with us. I hope all of you had wonderful things to learn from her today, and we hope to see you all in our next workshop. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your week. We'll see you all soon, everyone.